Okay, let's go to our next presentation. Of course, you can still write your thoughts in the chat if you want to, and we will pick them up then later on while we go on. As I understand, Norway is one of the countries that has been doing a lot of research about supported employment from almost every angle there is, different methods, etc. And today we have as a guest speaker Camilla Stubb-Lundberg from Oslo Metropolitan University and from their Work Research Institute. And she has chosen her title, What Can Disability Studies Teach Us About Disability and Work Inclusion? So Camilla, welcome, and now you are free to
Thank you.
start your presentation. Hello.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for the introduction. I will now go on and share my PowerPoint. Is it okay?
Yes, it's showing well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm honored to speak here at this webinar today. I am, as the title might suggest, primarily a disability studies scholar. And I believe that disability studies offers some important insights that can enrich and deepen our understanding of disability and work inclusion in general. That also is highly important for supported employment. And particularly, I want to explore how a critical lens from disability studies can help us rethink what it means to create truly inclusive work environments and what that mean. So this is kind of a conceptual presentation, slightly theoretical, but I will also use examples from others and from my own research. First, I want to, in a way, justify the need for a continued focus on disability and work inclusion through introducing the disability employment gap. So what is the disability employment gap? That implies that there is a gap between disabled people and non-disabled. The case is that in recent decades, we have seen research that emphasizes that employer attitudes towards disabled people have improved. And the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities also guarantees the equal right to work in an environment that is open, inclusive, and accessible. However, there are signs that actually inclusion and employees hiring disabled people, that this process doesn't move as fast as a pace as attitudes. So there is a gap also here. And so the employment inequality remains fairly stable. For instance, according to Statistics Norway in 2021, nearly 38% disabled people were employed, and compared to the general population, where the employment rate was 74%. So, nevertheless, there is a big gap. You could define disability, of course, in different ways, perhaps getting different results, but there is a significant gap. With this in mind, that's why we're here. It's a need for a continued focus on work inclusion. And I will use in today's presentation disability studies as a lenses to discuss how this could look like. And I also have another example of a Norwegian researcher that actually has objectively discovered discrimination of disabled employees. That is Kaja Larsen Østerud from OsloMet. For a couple of years ago, she sent out in a research project out pairwise fictional applications to a large pool of employers with both disabled and non-disabled applicants. And where the non-disabled applicants, despite stating similar qualifications, there was a significant difference in material where the disabled people less often was called into an interview. So there are hardcore evidence of actually discrimination, hiring discrimination out there. So I mentioned now disability studies quite a few times. I will give a brief introduction to what it means, and I will go deeper into it later into the presentation. The origins of disability studies is from the 1970s and 1980s, emerging from disability rights movement and their emphasis and struggle for inclusion in different areas of society. And their rights movement appeared at the same time as gender movements striving for equality and also Black movements. So that's not something specific. That area is decades where these things took place, actually. Disability studies helped highlight inequality by advocating for inclusive employment practices and legal protections, and still do. Disability studies is critical in framing. It has focused on challenging the medical framing to disability in terms of too much focus on lack, deficiencies, and in need of support. And it has also focused on disrupting norms that exist within able-bodied norms in today's society of being individualist, of being productive, and so on. And currently in disability studies, there is a focus on mainstreaming and expanding the field. So disability studies has been central also in other fields such as sociology, rehabilitation, occupational therapy, social work, and so on. And there are also, in order to answer, at least reflect on the question, what can disability studies teach us about disability and work inclusion? There are some similarities also between supported employment and disability studies, which is important to reflect upon. For instance, the growth of supported employment during the 1970s and 80s emerged as an alternative to sheltered workshops and vocational training. And this focus is also related to the principles and perspectives promoted by disability studies. So one can say that in a broad way, supported employment can be seen as a part of the broader movement to ensure that all people, regardless of disability, have the right to contribute meaningfully to society. So there is a common interest between the two fields regarding the focus on work inclusion and inclusion as a broad concept, accessibility in society, and the provision of equal opportunities. And they both pushes for a shift away from seeing disability as an individual problem to understanding it as a societal issue that requires collective action from employers and policymakers and frontline workers implementing employment policies, for instance. There are also differences to note when discussing the question of what can we learn from disability studies. Disability studies can have a broader perspective. It tends to be interested in analyzing the experiences of disabled people. First and foremost, it was disabled activists that actually was central in forming the field of study and still is. And disability studies also critically explore how societal structures, policies, and attitudes both include and exclude at the same time. So while we strive to include, one could at the same time analyze how exclusion manifests in the inclusionary practices. And disability studies tend to be less interested in the analysis of practical employment outcomes. And it tends to be idealistic and normative, whereas SE has an advantage in being more practice-oriented and more detailed regarding the work inclusion practices. Yeah. There are some examples of how researchers have applied disability studies to analyze supported employment outcomes in different ways. And here are two examples. The first way of intersecting these two fields is provided by Bauer, exploring supported employment and its impact on people with disabilities. So this study integrates disability studies to critically analyze the impact of supported employment in enhancing employment outcomes for disabled people, while it still considers broader societal barriers that persist in the workplace. And a second example of the intersection between supported employment and disability studies is that disability studies in itself has been taken up as relevant for the study of supported employment. So the other way, as they have some interconnections and common interest. And one example is Garrels, employment for persons with intellectual disability in a Nordic context. So this study of Garrels particularly argues for the use of the Nordic relational model to disability. The Nordic policy regarding people with disabilities promote values such as equality, participation, accessibility, and non-discrimination. And since the 1970s, actually, the Nordic countries can be linked to a relational model for understanding disability. And the article by Garrels applies this relational model to understand disability. And also writes that the relational model suggests that disability occurs when environmental requirements exceed personal capacity. It emphasizes the need for individualized support, for example, when individuals with different types of impairments seek to participate in the work arena. So the relational model points to, in a way, a gap between the structures around the individual and what the individual can do, and the focus into closing the gap. That's important. So this Nordic relational model has been exported from disability studies, for example, through the example of this study here. So there are also other examples of such an export. I will use my own research as an example to delve further into how I use disability studies in my own PhD studies to dwell critically upon our practices of inclusion and how they can be improved. The work consists of 3 articles, and the data material consists of interviews with disabled employees. I interviewed disabled entrepreneurs which started their own companies and hired primarily disabled people for various reasons. So it's a kind of collective entrepreneurship. Then I also interviewed frontline workers hiring disabled people and facilitating the hiring of disabled people, and worked with employer engagement to increase their willingness to hire disabled people. So I got the different perspectives on the different gatekeepers to employment. And I used a perspective which is central in disability studies, that is ableism. And ableism is rooted in the belief that non-disabled are superior, and it manifests in societal attitudes, practices, and policies that can marginalize and exclude disabled people. And I will go through one example of how this manifests in the data material. For example, in the second article, is there an ableist paradox in frontline workers' success stories about disability and work inclusion? In this article, I explored frontline workers' stories or narrative practices in an institutional use of stories, that is Norwegian Labour and Welfare Administration law. And the frontline workers brought up success stories when they talked about their practices of work inclusion. And these stories, they exemplify an ambitious borderland between an acknowledgement of disabled people as contributing productive citizens on the one hand, and at the same time, on the other hand, subtle tendencies to overvalue motivation and achievement that can be exclusionary for those that doesn't try hard enough, on the other hand. And the article introduces the term ableist paradox to capture the way frontline worker stories demonstrate such ambivalent understandings. So the frontline workers try to appear inclusive by fronting in a way how diversity can be productive and an asset. But if they do that to a degree that doesn't fit with all disabled people, it can also have exclusionary tendency. So that's at the core of disability studies, to critically explore practices of work inclusion. And I will also mention a famous author in disability studies, Jan Grue. He has also reminded us of all the, he's disabled himself, this reminded us of all the invisible work that disabled people must do to participate in an ableist society. Just to get to work in the morning, there's a lot of invisible time that is consumed, while for us non-disabled, this happens more automatic. So he reminds us of all the work it takes to participate in an ableist society, which is important, I think, when we discuss work inclusion. So what can disability studies teach us about disability and work inclusion? Disability studies have emphasized work inclusion as a conceptual point of departure for understanding processes that lead to marginalization as well as opportunities for participation. And by using disability studies as a lenses, we can point towards new work inclusion practices and witness different ethical dilemmas that appear as we engage in work inclusion. And I think the discussion by Mari between diversity and inclusion is relevant here. Because diversity points to a kind of affirmation of disability and other minority categories, which is important, but at the same time, we need to remember inclusion and support. And work inclusion needs to manage both these areas, but that can be tricky and can appear as a dilemma, which we need to study. And disability studies also reminds us that it is important to emphasize the perspectives of disabled people themselves. So disability studies reminds us to think critically about work inclusion systems. Do they really function inclusive, or are they just maintaining the status quo? Are we accommodating without challenging the larger systemic issues at play? And this points to the question in the group chat we need to separate between integration and inclusion. So disability studies reminds us to confront deep-seated assumptions about what constitutes productive work and who is capable of performing that work. It challenges ableist norms that equate efficiency, productivity, and success, which often leave disabled people out of the conversation. And it also challenges us to recognize that disability should not be seen as an exception or as someone other to be compensated for, but as a natural part of human diversity. So this question I will further explore in a Palgrave book proposal that I work on currently with disability researchers. And I will use a critical disability studies framework to explore these questions that I put up now forward. Yeah, that was my conceptual presentation. So my question for you, perhaps, that could be interested to gain some perception of the group chat, is that have anyone of you applied disability studies, and when and how? That will be interesting for me to know more about.
Tusen tack, Camilla. Thank you. As she placed to you all a question that have the audience, any of the audience, any plans for research, so please write that on the chat. And while you are thinking and writing, so I have a question for you. You were telling about what kind of tradition there are in this research field, and in the beginning, in the 70s and 80s, much of the research was combined with other fields. It's, for example, sociology or rehabilitation, and now this research is a little bit different. But in your experience, are there still some details or wider range of areas that there simply is not at all research, or just not enough? That what is the biggest gap in the research field that we would need more information about? What's your experience when you have, for example, read different kind of studies while doing your own research?
Actually, thank you for the question. I think there is a real potential for using disability studies to complement the goal of supported employment, because they have a common interest. And whereas supported employment have its benefits in discussing and suggesting new practices of work inclusion and trends in work inclusion, I think disability studies can complement this approach and remind us that we always have to think critically in our inclusionary practices. How can these inclusionary practices also have exclusionary tendencies, and how could we work with this dilemma in a way to promote inclusion? I think that's an important way forward. And while I've seen some topics and some research articles discussing it, I think here is a potential for much more research. Also because it has, in a way, similar origins and similar goals.
Of course, in this group of delegates that we are sitting now, most of us think that to most of the problems, the supported employment is the answer, and it is already there. You don't have to invent it. But otherwise, do you think that we still need some kind of other perspectives to the research, for example, connecting to the other fields of science, like in a whole, a kind of very different idea that usually are not combined to disability studies and research at all? I mean, the societal research is quite natural answer to that. But do you see that from other fields could be picked up something also to disability research?
Yeah, I think disability studies have a big scope, and it's becoming more and more important, and it's expanding into new fields. So I think in the last decade, disability studies have been sort of mainstreams into different fields. For instance, into organizational studies, occupational therapy. So both theoretically fields and practice-oriented field. So yeah, I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but there is a potential, a big potential for mainstreaming, I think. And I think disability studies reminds us to navigate potential stigma and othering effects of inclusionary practices that we actually do. That's a challenge when we strive for inclusion with welfare support and employer engagement. That stigma and othering effects will follow, and we need to navigate these issues too.
And of course, in this group, there's quite often the answer that we need more research still about employer engagement, how to reach them better and how to better collect their needs. Because then, of course, the answer would be that how can they better hire people with different disabilities and lacks in their workability.
Yeah, I have an article now in Work, Employment and Society for review where I actually, the topic is employer engagement and how frontline workers engage employers, particular focus on how and when they disclose disability. Because if the frontline workers disclose disability to the employers too early, this might cause stigma and also cause employers to back out. And if they wait too long, and if they talk too much about abilities, and not about the support, that's also a dilemma. So it's a kind of, they have a lot of practices, the frontline workers, that present us with how they navigate this as a real dilemma, disclosure of disability, when they engage employers to hire disabled people. So I think it's important to remember all the nuances in all the practices that we do and the dilemmas. Yeah. So that's a sociological journal. So.
Okay. Good to know. There is also one comment in the chat. Maybe I will read it out loud for you. Via training disabled people with the methods of supported employment, we have succeeded in creating many workplaces when the employer skills and job requirements meet in a way that allows a disabled person to succeed in an equal basis. These experiences have shown that involving the employer and the work community in the including initiation of a new employee on is almost in a critical way important to promoting inclusion. And I think this comment emphasizes a quite critical and quite crucial element of the whole topic about the whole work community being involved in somehow. That it's not. We all know that it's not only as the responsibility for some persons in the management or HR or a couple of individuals who are helping people with disabilities, but it should be more or less and find a way to how the whole work community can involve in this issue. Any ideas on that? What would you like to answer to this comment?
Yes, I think it's great comments because I think inclusion needs it needs more than integration. It needs more than just accommodating the disabled individual into an ableist workplace in a way. So I think at AFE you have Kjetil Frøyland and Øystein Spjelkavik, for instance, with their approach about having a mentor at the workplace. In addition, that the workplace and the employers need to be able to cooperate with the support system. So I think you need discussion of the natural supports, of course, in the workplace. That's important and could also be a way to avoiding or negotiating stigma that follows, that you use this natural support. But still, and it's also about finding the match in a way and seeing work inclusion as a process, a work in progress all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think, the match which the comments here is about, creating workplace where the employee skills and job requirements meet, that's important. And also in my PhD, I interviewed disabled entrepreneurs. For instance, deaf entrepreneurs who only hired deaf employees in a way that applied and took advantage of different senses when it came to visionary and creating movies, for instance. So they used disability and framed it into an ability. And we have that, so that is one example, but and also entrepreneurs with ADHD who only hired employees with ADHD in more practice-based occupations. So these are also examples of a matching process, which is very important, but that cannot at the same time create certain stereotypes of what people can do and cannot. But it emphasizes the same thing as here, that the match, of course, is important.
Then there's still another comment. The relational model in disability studies can be, so to speak, translated to a workplace and use the tool to decide what support is needed and how to provide the support.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I think the relational model, it is really important in the Nordic countries, and it's also manifested in disability employment policies in the Nordic countries. And that's the most common expert from disability studies, I think, the relational model. And I think that's a good way of seeing work inclusion, basically, because to be able to include, you need to work with the structures and the employers. But at the same time, you have to work, this has to be done in a way that suits the individual and their competencies. So you have to navigate both the individual and their competencies and their abilities at the same time as you work with the surroundings and the relation between these two. And the relation can shift in different situations and contexts in a way, so it's not a static process, but it's a dynamic relational process.
Quite right. Okay, thank you again, Camilla.